All content in this video, including but not limited to text, graphics, images, audio, and video, is the property of Toward Health and is protected by international copyright laws. Unauthorized distribution, reproduction, modification, or use of this content without prior written permission from Toward Health is strictly prohibited. For permissions, please contact us at contact@drtro.com.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I know it's been an amazing workshop and seminar. You've seen some amazing presentations, and I'm going to cap it off with a talk about sweeteners. We're going to discuss everything you need to know about sweeteners, including how they got to market, what's on the market, and what are some of the effects on our bodies. What should you know about? And hopefully this will be a comprehensive review where you'll be able to walk away and understand maybe where you are in your sort of metabolic health and weight loss journey, what sweeteners you should use, maybe what you should avoid, and how this should progress over time. I hope you find it valuable. Basically, we'll go through some of the artificial sweeteners, and we'll talk about some of the non-nutritive sweeteners. The artificial sweeteners are chemical compounds. We've made them, we've designed them to be sweet. And then there are others that are naturally found, but they're processed and boiled down and used in various products that we've all come to recognize and know. And we will also talk about the effects on your metabolism, on insulin sensitivity, the gut microbiome, and how they make our brains react. I think it's important to understand it's not always just about the calories and the caloric effect. It's, how do these substances, how do these chemicals affect us globally? And, I'm going to start with my own example, how I started with using sort of sweeteners and alternative products. And this is a graph that I made using my Amazon purchases and the consumption of Rosette's Mix and Quest bars. And you could see here 10 years ago when I was first starting out, I was coming from the modern processed food environment, and I couldn't stop eating, chocolate cakes and chocolate ice cream and vanilla ice cream and cereal. And so, it was a very, very challenging time for me. I was coming from the modern food environment that we're all used to, and I also had some food addiction. So it was very, very difficult for me. So I needed some help transitioning to lower carb, higher protein foods. And, I wish I could have stuck to a real food diet at that point, but it wasn't realistic. And so, when I first started my first year, I just want to show you, I bought over 50 boxes of Quest bars. And then, a couple years later, that came down to 30 boxes of Quest protein bars, which, they're a low carb, high protein bar. And then in 2018, this is now 3 or 4 years into my journey, you could see the use of these became very rare. Maybe I'd use it a couple times a week. Whereas initially I would have a couple of these products per day. And then in 2020, I barely had any of these protein bars and really just only occasionally had some, homemade almond flour cookies. And then in the last several years of my diet, these are something I use very, very rarely. I don't even crave them anymore. And when I do crave them, I have them, I enjoy them, but it's very infrequent. And I'm showing you this not as, not that you need to copy exactly what I do, and not that you should rush in and, only eat real food. You need to assess where you are in your own journey. And if you told me on day one, you're going to be eating only steaks and eggs, and an occasional, broccoli rabe, I would have looked at you like you were crazy. And I don't think that I would have been able to make it. And I certainly would have had difficulty in holidays and gatherings and birthdays. So I think the ideal, and my ideal is certainly real food, and my ideal has been real food really ever since early on, but I recognized where I was. and I was true to myself with what I needed to make this a sustainable approach for me. And that's changed over time, and it doesn't mean I don't have any. I may be on vacation, we may be in a rest stop, and I may pick up a protein bar, or I may, if everybody's having ice cream on a warm summer day, I may occasionally have like a low sugar ice cream, but these are very rare. I don't do them often. And the key takeaway I want you to take is, these are the mottos in our clinic, and you'll understand why we have these mottos, I think, after the presentation. But these are our mottos. Right now, our motto in our clinic is replace what you can't restrict. If you're just starting your journey and you are looking to make this something sustainable, and that you struggle with certain foods, you struggle with pizza, maybe you struggle with chocolate or ice cream, you need to figure out a way. Those cravings aren't going to go away, so you need to figure out what that you can't live without. If you have dieted your entire life and you always struggle with chocolate, or you always struggle with bread, you really need to think about how you're going to make that happen. You may want to make an almond flour bread. You may want to make, a fathead dough pizza, or use Rosette's mix to make a pizza. You may want to do that, or go to Blaze and get a pizza. Or you may decide that's something you can restrict. But if you know deep down that that's not something that's going to go away easily, find a way to replace it. Use the harm reduction process. Find something that's low carb version to start, and replace those items that you have difficulty restricting. You need to be able to address your cravings. They're going to happen. They're not going to magically disappear. So our motto in our practice is replace what you can't restrict, meaning find a low carb replacement for the foods you're going to struggle with. Now, does that mean you should be having the low carb pizza every day or the protein bar every day? Well, no. It's really as little as you need. The second motto we have is break the glass, only in case of emergency. And you can see here, there's a picture of that, because these foods, they're made, they're products. They're made to taste good. They're made to captivate you. And while they could be a good bridge, they should only be a bridge. They should only be a crutch. And if you find that you're eating these substances day over day over day, you may want to ask yourself, am I actually hungry? Do I actually want this? Is there something else I should be doing? Should I be having a bigger dinner? Am I stressed? Are there emotions that I may not be processing? Am I lacking enjoyment? Can I find enjoyment, in another way? Am I just bored sitting in my house late at night when the kids are asleep? You have to ask yourself, why am I eating? And so that's the conundrum here. Feel free to use these, substitutes as a strategy to replace what you struggle with your whole life. But once you're using them, monitor how you use them. If you're using them every day and you're using them, again and again and more, I think it's time to pause, ask yourself why, ask yourself, am I really hungry? And is there something else going on? So, make sure you're only using it as a break the glass in case of emergency. And if you're breaking the glass day after day, call your health coach, call your team, message us on the app message board and say, hey guys, I think there's something going on here, and get some help, get some peer support. So that's my key takeaways for you, and we'll go into the data and drill in maybe why I came to these conclusions. And hopefully you all agree with me and think these conclusions are valid and helpful for you. So I'm going to give an overview of sort of the approved artificial sweeteners, and you see some of them here. You may recognize some of them. You have saccharin here, which interestingly enough, FDR was one of the biggest proponents of saccharin. It's been around, since 1879. And he had diabetes and he used saccharin, and I think his statement was, if somebody doubts the benefits of saccharin, they'd be stupid, and that was FDR. But later we found certainly that in large quantities in mice it caused cancer, and that was decades later. And there's been some other sweeteners approved, cyclamate, which is approved in 1958 but was later banned. This is actually one of the sweeteners that are used widely, the most commonly used sweeteners in Mexico and Europe. So, it's just important to know that that's a sweetener that's not really used in the United States, but it is used around. And then, the next sweetener that was really brought to market was aspartame. And, I have a slide based on that, but that's Equal, or the blue packet. And then there's acesulfame potassium, which was approved in 1988, and that's called the sweet one, or ACE-K, and that was approved in 1988, and we'll talk about that. In 1998, sucralose was approved. Sucralose is very much like the glucose molecule, except it has hydroxyl groups on 3 of the hydrogen groups. So it's very similar to sugar, to glucose, but it has, chloride groups instead of hydroxyl groups. And then there's neotame, which was approved in 2022, Advantame, which is much more recent. These are you won't see them. And we have stevia, which is derived from the stevia plant. That was approved in 2015, and that's that green package. And there's some other words, there's some other ones, sugar alcohols like erythritol, maltitol, sorbitol, which we'll go into, and monk fruit is certainly another one. And believe it or not, these are ubiquitous. These are in over 23% of packaged foods and beverages. So I think it's important to get an idea of how we got here. And this is also important because I mentioned FDR back in 1879. He said sweet and low. It was discovered, in 1879, and he popularized it in his presidency, and because of his diabetes, he used it, and he said anybody who didn't use it was stupid. So I found that funny. But this whole the sort of Diet Cokes and diet products, these really started in 1960s, and you can see despite the use of these increasing, really obesity has increased. You can see here in 1980s, after aspartame was approved and approved to use in soda, Diet Coke was launched, and by that time 28% of Americans were drinking and using these products, and you can see here that basically obesity is still blossomed during that time. And the companies using these, these are really, the use of these is propagated by these companies that you see here, the Hateful Eight, really the Big Food. These are the people using these products. So it's important to be aware you're not going to find this in the dairy aisle, you're not going to find this in the meat aisle, and you're not going to find it in the produce aisle. So it's predominantly in products, and we know that these processed foods are uniquely harmful. So it's something to keep in mind, that they're made literally to promote profits. And this is just for your information, don't think when you walk into these stores, and you're looking at these labels, you have to understand these labels are designed by the government and the USDA and the FDA, but they are heavily lobbied by Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, and the name of the game really is just to confuse you. It's just to make something that's not healthy seem healthy, so it's important to know that things are not as easy as they seem. If you see something on a label, and I just uncovered this, with products that are used in the sort of metabolic health space, like LMNT and Ultima, which are electrolytes. On the labels, they say natural flavors, but then they hide ingredients in those natural flavors. So it's important to know that these labels do not even include all the ingredients that are in the product, and their purpose really is to, in my opinion, to make products look healthier than they are. So I'd be very, very cautious when you're looking at these labels. They're not all inclusive. They're quite complicated. In fact, if there's less than 0.5 grams of something, they don't even have to include it on the label. So they could put 0.5 grams of maltodextrin, an addictive product, addictive carbohydrate, or they could put 0.5 grams of MSG and not have to include that on the label. And there was a lawsuit against LaCroix Seltzer because they, were found to use mood-altering substances in low quantities in their natural, quote unquote, natural flavors. And this is important. I'm sorry, the slide came out a little bit blurry, but this is important, and I want you to know this because the food industry has an incredible influence on research. This is the CEO, the ex-CEO of Pepsi, and she's donated tons of money to Harvard and has been involved in Harvard, and there's a Harvard wing at the Kresge building at the School of Public Health. So, all of these plant-based products, like from Quaker and, Nabisco, they have a lot of influence over our academics and academia, and mainly through contributions and donations. So it's important to understand when you're looking at papers from Harvard or when you're looking at a paper from Stanford, that you understand, there's probably some corporate interests that have weaseled their way in. And that's why the news gets really confusing. 1 minute eggs are good because of the nutritional research, and 1 minute eggs are bad and they're going to lead to heart disease and death. And, you're left thinking, well, I don't know what to make of this anymore. Are eggs good or eggs bad? Is erythritol good? Is erythritol bad? And sometimes as the consumer, not as a physician, I notice in my family, they're just confused. They're like, did you see the new news today, Tro? Coffee can cause depression in, twins, right? Or, maybe fatty foods, can cause, sexual dysfunction in men, right? And it just seems like the news is not stopping, and it takes advantage of our fear and anxiety, and it's tough to know what's the truth. And so hopefully this lecture can help you, empower you with a little bit more information, so it's not random medical news, so you understand a little bit the science behind it. So I think the first thing to understand when you're dealing with nutrition research is, the pinnacle of nutrition research is doing a randomized trial, which means you take patients and you give a group of them a product like, let's say, Splenda or Stevia, and then you give another group just a placebo, something completely inert, and you compare the differences in outcomes. But the reality is in nutrition, that doesn't happen. They use surveys of hundreds of thousands of people, and they try to match them up with medical records, and that creates, it's called observational data, and it's very, very flawed. But that's the over-preponderance, that's the overabundance of the literature in the nutrition space is based on this type of observational data. All the data you see coming out of Harvard and Stanford saying 100,000 people, survey showed that, bacon causes rectal cancer, right? This is based on survey data. It's not the gold standard. It's actually very flimsy data, but the people in the nutrition academia say, well, that's the best we got. We're never going to be able to do a long-term study with bacon, and so we have to rely on this data. But that data is so hard to draw conclusions from, and it's sometimes so antithetical to the diet trials that are actually done in this randomized way that it's hard to believe. And I'll give you an example. There's been a large study from Harvard showing that meat causes causes diabetes. So that eating meat and eggs can raise your risk of having diabetes. And yet, Virta has done 5-year studies showing that eating a meat-based diet, a low-carb ketogenic diet, actually causes diabetes remission, almost doubly as effective as calorie-controlled approaches. So when the data from interventional trials is so antithetical to these large observational studies, we really have to stop and think. And John Ioannidis, one of the most cited researchers, says that really nutritional epidemiology needs to be thrown in the garbage. So some people feel very strongly against it, and I'm one of those people. And this is what you all are dealing with. This is the news. Splenda causes DNA damage, and artificial sweeteners are the good guy, or actually not. Maybe they're the bad guy. And erythritol causes strokes and heart attacks, and maybe it doesn't, maybe it does. So this is confusing. So hopefully we can shed some light. And here you are, this is new guidelines. WHO says actually don't use sweeteners, and the NIH here is saying, wait a second, erythritol may cause cardiovascular problems. And so you don't know what to do. So let's start with the sweeteners. We're going to go deep dive into each one of them. There's saccharin. I mentioned this was found, over 100 years ago, and this is rapidly excreted in the urine, does not accumulate in the body, and it's very, very sweet, and it's used in a lot of soft drinks, and I'm sure you've seen these in diners. It's believed not to cause cancer, although there's some compelling animal data that it does. So there is no warning label required, even though in animals at high doses it was shown to cause cancer. It does not have a warning label here in the United States. In a couple other countries, there are warning labels. This may cause cancer. And there's another one which we'll talk about later, acesulfame K, and it's very, very sweet. You'll find it in chewing gum, in some dry beverage mixes, and breath mints, cough drops. And this is really not metabolized in the body. It's largely excreted through the stool. Another one, which you all know, the yellow packet. This is sucralose, and it's not metabolized by the body. Basically, there's the hydroxyl groups of sugar are replaced with chlorine, and it is not absorbed by the GI tract, and it's very, very sweet. But you have to be careful because these are packed often with another ingredient called maltodextrin. So there are some carbs in this, even though the sucralose aspect of it doesn't absorb. And these can be used in baking and tabletop sweeteners and soft drinks. This is predominantly, I think, one of the most, at this point, it's probably the most used sweetener. Aspartame, and we're going to go into this one a little bit. It's basically made up of 2 amino acids, which are combined through a methyl group. But it's really thought to have it has no caloric effect. There is a problem. People with a certain disease called PKU or phenylketonuria, they can't metabolize this, and it can accumulate and really cause some problems. So generally, we want children not to have this, but again, you'll see here in the label, a lot of times the aspartame is also cut with a bit of dextrose and maltodextrin. And it's interesting how this was approved, and I just want to give you an idea of the, how this was approved. So this took 16 years to approve through the FDA, and the it was. There was a company called Searle, and actually Donald Rumsfeld was the CEO of Searle, and you may remember him from the Bush administration and the Reagan administration. But before he was involved, he was the CEO of Searle, and they tried to get this approved, but no matter what they did, because of the animal data, because of the human data, the FDA would not approve it, and so they really struggled. 16 years, the FDA scientists said no, and then what happened was, Ronald Reagan becomes president, and part of his administration was Donald Rumsfeld, and they appoint Dr. Arthur Hayes Hull as the FDA commissioner. And on day one of his approval, Equal was approved. He overrid the scientists at the FDA, and he approved Equal. So it really wasn't done because of the safety data. It was done seemingly as a political favor. Interesting, if you look this up, Dr. Arthur Hayes Hull, he had a scandal. Apparently he was caught taking bribes, but that didn't stop him from later working in an academic institution. So, a lot of problems with these. Aspartame gets more complaints than any other sweetener, and it's linked with maybe 167 possible side effects. There's other data saying it's fine, but there's other data saying that it could cause some neurologic issues at high doses. So still somewhat controversial, but we'll go into it a little bit more. Certainly, there's sugar alcohols, and this is mannitol, maltitol, sorbitol, xylitol, and there's certainly erythritol is not listed here, but erythritol is another one. And these are sugar alcohols. They do get partially absorbed in the body, not much. Most of it passes through the GI tract, but some of it does get absorbed, and it's less calorically dense, so it's believed not to have sort of the same impact calorically, and it's it's used in a lot of sugar-free products. It can really give you gas and abdominal pain. Watch out. And it doesn't spike sugar as much, but it still can raise blood sugar levels. And there's other natural sweeteners, quote unquote. Stevia is found from the stevia plant, and the newest kid on the block is, allulose. Allulose is found in figs naturally, raisins, molasses, and stevia, or you may see this. It's also found in the stevia plant, basically. And the one we're going to focus on today is really that I'll go into a little bit more depth is erythritol, because that's had a lot of news lately. But let's look at them as a whole. So this was a study, looking at the cardiometabolic effects of sweeteners. This is again that flawed nutritional epidemiology I was telling you about. When we look at thousands and thousands of participants, and we used sort of surveys to see how, what is associated, with the use of sweeteners. Are they associated with good outcomes or not? And, I found some interesting data in this study. And of course, here you saw the link there, so you can always pull up the study yourself. But, this is, predominantly the sweeteners that were used in their cohort, the Nutrisante cohort. The Nutrisante cohort. You can see those cyclamates that I talked to you about that were that's not really in the U.S., but predominantly the biggest one in Europe and where their cohort was aspartame. Sucralose was up there as well, and acesulfame potassium was up there. And this is where people are eating them. It's in soft drinks predominantly. You can see 50% of the sweeteners are being, absorbed through soft drinks, and then, the packets of sweeteners would be, second place, and then artificially sweetened yogurts and cottage cheeses, and, then really other causes are much smaller. But this is, which sweeteners we're eating. In the United States, sucralose is a little bit higher, but you can see where we're eating them from. added to other food products like dairy and mostly drinks, soft drinks, but certainly other drinks as well. So what was the key findings? Again, you have to take it with a grain of salt because this is just associated, but it showed that people who had more of these artificial sweeteners were associated with a increased risk for cardiovascular events, including stroke, and it was associated with a higher risk of obesity and diabetes. It doesn't mean necessarily it's the cause of it. It just means people who gravitate those also seem to have these problems. And this was an interesting sentence here. I just wanted to point out to you in the cohort, right? The total artificial sweetener intake was associated with both cardiovascular events and strokes. But in particularly, aspartame was associated with the highest increase of strokes, and while acesulfame, potassium, and sucralose was associated with more increased coronary heart disease risks, and they didn't find any benefit to using sweeteners or using any added sweeteners. So it's interesting, we use these products really because we want to be healthy, but it doesn't seem like they necessarily make us that much more healthy overall. I'm not saying you should avoid it. If you have diabetes or metabolic disease, you probably should use it. But it's interesting that it doesn't seem to have an effect in the big population data. We know in our patients with diabetes, it certainly has a profound effect on lowering blood sugar. So this is a study that made headlines very recently, and I want you to be aware of it. I told you we're going to focus on erythritol a little bit. This was a study done in Cleveland Clinic, and Stanley Hazen was the cardiologist who really led this. And this was a very interesting study. It was published in Nature Medicine, a very good journal. And they did two studies, okay, and they combined it in one. They did an association study. They said, wait, let's see if people write that they eat foods with erythritol and how their cardiovascular mortality is. And they found people that had, who reported eating a lot of erythritol in a survey also tended to have a lot of cardiovascular mortality. But the step they took further, which I found very interesting, was they took this erythritol and they said, let's measure what happens to the erythritol that's absorbed in the blood. So they gave it to people, they measured it in the blood, and they found that blood increased, the erythritol increased how sticky those platelets were. And it took 5 to 7 days after the erythritol consumption for that, for the blood to get less thick and less sticky. So they proved a very plausible mechanism to suggest that this cardiovascular mortality it could be potentially real. They didn't prove it per se, but they proved a potential way by making that platelet a little bit sticky and the blood a little bit sticky and more likely to clot. So this was a very interesting study, and it made me pause and think, maybe I should not eliminate it, but really seek to lower my consumption of sweeteners. And they did a follow-on study, Hazen did a follow-on study where they actually gave healthy people, because there was a question after that study, maybe those people, were just unhealthy people. They were people who were turning to erythritol because they had diabetes. So they took healthy people and they gave them erythritol, and they compared it to glucose, and they found that the erythritol actually did the same thing. It made healthy people, their blood just a little bit more reactive, the platelets a little bit more reactive, and it took 3 to 7 days to clear. It's not been shown to increase the risk of heart attack, stroke, and death. It's just associated with it. This is the graphic from their study, and I took a picture of sort of what they did, and they showed how basically ingesting erythritol made that blood more likely to clot. So I think it's interesting. Our bodies naturally make erythritol. It's not like it's a substance we don't have. But if you were to have a large amount of this, 30 grams, 50 grams, it does take 5 days to clear. So it made me pause and say, okay, these aren't, there's no free lunch, and these things do go into our bodies and they do have an effect. So made me pause and think about it. I still not recommend these products, but if you have diabetes, I certainly say, going to a diet product is a good first start. But then, like I said in the beginning, considering making it just a crutch and not something you do every day. Now I want to turn to sucralose, and this was another recent study done with sucralose. So Splenda, this is a very, very interesting study, sort of done in humans, and I'm sharing with you because this showed that sucralose, when combined with maltodextrin, which is how it's actually found, it's found to in packets to be combined with maltodextrin. It actually caused the brain to want more food, crave more food, and it worsened insulin sensitivity. So these things have an impact on our body, in combination with other stuff, but also sort of on their own. So sucralose impaired insulin sensitivity when consumed with carbohydrates. In this case, they did it with maltodextrin, this was a well done study that I think you all should pay attention to. And it interestingly, when it was in small quantities and without carbohydrates, sucralose did not seem to impair insulin sensitivity. And I'll show you sort of what it looks like. So this is the fasting insulin level of people who just had the sugar, who just had the Splenda. You can see, people who had the Splenda, it did come up a little bit, the insulin level. But when you combined the maltodextrin and the Splenda, the insulin went through the roof, and you can see that it really, really went high. And you can see here, this is the amount of insulin that's released, just the sugar alone, just the sweetener alone. You can see even just the sweetener had an effect, right? But there was that prolonged effect after the combination. So this was a good study from Dallenberg. And really, we've known there's been an impact on sucralose, for quite some time. This is 2013. That prior study was I believe from 2021. We've known for a long time that sucralose may have a effect on our response, our glucose sensitivity. And you can see here from this study in diabetes care that sucralose increased the glucose levels, the insulin levels, and the C-peptide levels when consumed before a glucose load. And it really reduced the insulin sensitivity and impairs sort of insulin clearance, meaning, these are not metabolically neutral, substances. They are something that does drive insulin resistance and makes it worse. So there's two pretty convincing studies here that sucralose, it's not this benign 0-calorie substance. It does have an impact on how well your body processes sugar and how insulin sensitive it is. And you can see here, very similar to those other graphs, people who had the sucralose had this prolonged sort of insulin release. They had hyperinsulinemia, and their glucose was worse. You could see it here, their glucose tolerance was not as good compared to water. So even though this is not absorbed in any way, it's still priming the pump, and it seems to be contributing to the insulin resistance epidemic we see in our society. And it seems to also have an effect on other hormones that lead to satiety. In this case, GIP was altered. So I found that pretty interesting. This is another study. This was done by Tino Just, and they were looking at does the sweet taste from sweeteners, from sucrose, from saccharin, does the sweet taste drive insulin? And what they found was saccharin also stimulates insulin release even in the absence of glucose, meaning It is just you anticipating and having that sweet taste in your mouth, in the case of saccharin, that triggers an insulin response. So these things do have an impact on our insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance. So don't view them as a free lunch. Don't view them as a free food, as a 0 calorie. That's all a marketing ploy. These are hormonally active substances. And you can see here, it's rising up. Just the taste of the saccharin is rising up insulin just as much as sugar. And this was a study with acesulfame K. This was done in rats, and there's been other ones done in humans, but basically, acesulfame K is a potent modulator of insulin, both in animals and in humans. It causes insulin release. Again, this is labeled as a 0 calorie, 0 sugar sweetener, but it's basically potentiating insulin secretion. And then what about the microbiome? Everybody asks me, well, how does this affect the microbiome? Right? So actually, this is a study from very recently in 2022. This was published in Nature, looking at Jotham Suez, looking at how these alter the microbiome. And artificial sweeteners absolutely induce glucose intolerance. And the way they do it, and that's what was interesting about this study, is by altering the gut microbiome. So it's actually the changes in the microbiome that lead to the insulin resistance. And this is a complex graph, but let me make it super easy for you. Basically, they were able to show that they gave a bunch of rats water, sucrose, glucose, aspartame, sucralose, and saccharin. And then they compared, okay, well, what's the blood sugar response to each one of those? Certainly we know that, sugar is going to have the biggest blood glucose response, and glucose is going to have the biggest, blood glucose response, right? But we saw, that other things, right? Other things actually still sort of raised the blood insulin levels, and they'll be on the second page here. Nope. No, they won't be. Hold on. Well, I can't go back to that other slide because of little technical difficulties, but let me tell you what that study did. So they took sucralose and they gave it to a bunch of mice, and just like it did in humans, it worsened the glucose tolerance, meaning they gave mice glucose after they gave them a sucralose heavy diet, and what they found was their glucose tolerance worsened. And that wasn't the interesting part. They found that the microbiome actually changed in response to the glucose. So when they did a fecal transplant, they literally took that microbiome and they gave it to another mouse. They took a mouse and they gave it antibiotics to give it no gut flora. They completely wiped its gut flora, and they gave it the microbiome from this mouse that had sucralose. And what they found was, before they gave the mouse the fecal transplant, the microbiome transplant, it had a normal glucose response. When they gave them the microbiome from the sucralose-fed group, from the sweetener-fed group, from the other mouse, they were able to transplant glucose tolerance. So meaning that part of that glucose tolerance that comes from these substances is how they're affecting our microbiome. So bottom line, what does this mean, Tro? You're like, Tro, just tell me what it means, right? These substances are hormonally active and probably mediated through how they impact our gut. And they also affect our neurochemicals. And this is something I want to show you. This is a study published in JAMA showing that these sweeteners have an impact, right? They were looking to see, do these sweeteners, do they have metabolic responses? Do they make people eat more? Do they make people want more food, right? And in this trial, what they did was they gave these sweeteners to women, and what they found was in women who were overweight, these sweeteners actually made them more likely, the reward areas of the brain were lighting up for food when they had these sweeteners. And this was compared to regular sugar. So they gave them sugar and their brain areas weren't lighting up as much, but when they gave them these sweeteners, their brain areas were on fire for food, which means that these sweeteners may have, a neurologic impact. And this was a study, I'll go into the study design. They compared, the sucralose drinks to the sucrose drinks to the water drinks. And, they found basically that the artificial sweeteners had a huge impact on the desire for food. Let's see. Yeah, this is a slide from that study, showing that particularly in women, and particularly overweight women, that it had some effect in men, but much more in women and much more in overweight women, that these sweeteners increase the desire for food. Okay, so allulose. Here's the new kid on the block. Everybody wants to know about allulose, and I'll just quickly, say, like, look, whenever there's a new sweetener, you hear all the bad stuff on the old sweeteners, so you think, okay, let me go to this new kid on the block because there's something compelling about it. And what I'll caution you is remember, it took like almost 100 years to find out about saccharin, right? Some of these products are on for 15 years before they're withdrawn. They go through 20 years of getting through the FDA, and they're squeaked in by political favors. So, erythritol, a substance that's naturally made in our own bodies, now is implicated in thickening the blood and maybe being implicated in cardiovascular disease. Splenda, is worsening our insulin resistance, and it potentially is altering our microbiome. So you're like, well, where do I go? And so people are turning to stevia because it's newer and it's from a plant, and likewise people are turning to allulose. And all I can say is, we don't know. We don't have studies, and they're the new kids on the block. So, everybody's saying, well, oh, look at how great these are, and I've looked into allulose, and when you look, some of the comments that are made about allulose, and this is a particular study sort of looking into it, is saying, oh, it's naturally found. Well, erythritol is naturally found. Stevia is naturally found. That doesn't mean much, but they're saying, oh, it has Ozempic-like qualities. It releases GLP-1, and so I looked into the data, and essentially it doesn't look any different than erythritol. On my read of the data. So all I would caution you is that, I look through some of the data, and certainly, allulose looks interesting, but it's just the new kid on the block. Stevia looks interesting, but it's just the new kid on the block. Monk fruit is likewise interesting. It's been around a long time. All of these are naturally made, but we don't have the data yet to say one is better than the other. If I had to make a guess, if I had to choose for me, I think I tend to lean towards stevia, towards allulose, towards monk fruit, and if I was going to pick a sugar alcohol, it would be erythritol. But all of these, I look to minimize as much as possible. You can see 10 years ago, I was using them daily, and as time has gone on, I just use them as infrequently as I can. And that doesn't mean, you can have an ideal and slowly get there and not beat yourself up about it. Every now and then, I still have some, a protein bar or a Rosette's, product, or, and I don't beat myself up about it, but I do try to stick to real food. And I stopped deluding myself, and I stopped, having this brain space that says it has no calories, so it's fine. No. These are complex. They have complex effect on our metabolic health. They can impact our insulin sensitivity, our gut microbiome, how our brains process this. And really, it's too early to say one is better than the other. definitively, I think from my perspective, I stay away from saccharin, aspirin. I try to stay away from sucralose, and I try to lean towards stevia and monk fruit and allulose. And I have a question mark with erythritol. I still on occasion use it, but with all of them, I try to decrease it. So use it as a harm reduction tool. When not needed, eliminate it and or use sparingly. And again, I'm going to reiterate, this is a 10-year process for me. I went, and I did not beat myself up all throughout the way. If I used it, even though I knew it wasn't an ideal, I didn't beat myself up about it, and I still don't beat myself up about it, but I try to progress towards my ideal. And I'm going to come back to our mottos, which is you need to simultaneously replace what you can't restrict, meaning if you know you struggle with pizza, well, go to the Blaze Pizza, go to the Fathead Pizza, go to the Rosette's Mix Pizza, and replace it, especially if you have diabetes, metabolic syndrome, weight issues, and you're trying to stick to this diet. Just replace it. Address your cravings. Plan for your cravings. You've struggled with this food your whole life. You might as well plan for it up front. But once you start to get a handle of it and you're in control and you're confident, then look to reduce, move away from harm reduction and start to approach your ideal